The mid-morning sun hung over the Mojave Desert like a judgment, a blinding white eye that scorched the earth and turned the air into a shimmering curtain of heat which distorted the horizon line of the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, a place where the United States Army went to sharpen its iron against the unforgiving anvil of the simulated battlefield. And on this particular Tuesday, the temperature inside the vast, open-air maintenance bays of the Heavy Armor Division was pushing 110 degrees Fahrenheit, a suffocating blanket of dry heat that smelled of diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the acrid, metallic tang of superheated steel. In the center of Bay 4, the monstrous silhouette of an M1A2 SEP-3 Abrams main battle tank, a 68-ton beast of composite armor and lethal precision christened Widowmaker, sat silent and brooding, its turbine engine cowling stripped back to reveal the complex mechanical heart that had inexplicably failed during the pre-dawn mobilization drills, creating a crisis that was currently vibrating through the entire battalion chain of command, because this wasn't just a routine training rotation, but a high-visibility live-fire demonstration for a visiting Congressional Oversight Committee and 3 Allied generals who were currently sitting in an air-conditioned observation tower 2 miles away, expecting to see the pinnacle of American armored warfare, not a static display of mechanical incompetence. Pacing furiously in front of the paralyzed tank was Captain Marcus Sterling, a man whose ambition was as polished as his boots used to be before the dust of the box, coated everything in a fine layer of talc-like powder, and whose face was currently a mask of flushed, perspiring rage as he barked orders at a terrified group of junior mechanics who were scrambling over the hull like panicked ants, trying to diagnose a pressure fault in the turbine that the digital diagnostic computers insisted did not exist. Sterling was the new breed of officer, a West Point graduate with a degree in systems engineering who believed that warfare was a math problem to be solved with data, speed, and absolute adherence to the technical manual, and he viewed anything that deviated from the projected timeline not as a variable, but as a personal insult to his command capability. He checked his watch for the 10th time in 2 minutes, the expensive chronograph glinting in the harsh light, and saw that they had less than 40 minutes before the battalion was ordered to the line of departure, a deadline that felt like a noose tightening around his neck because if Widowmaker, his lead tank, the command vehicle, didn't roll, he would be forced to command from a backup Humvee, a humiliation that would signal to every superior officer watching that he couldn't maintain his own equipment. "I don't care what the laptop says, Sergeant," Sterling screamed, his voice cracking over the roar of a recovery vehicle passing nearby, his finger jabbing toward the open engine deck where a young E5 was staring blankly at a ruggedized tablet. "The turbine isn't cycling. We have 0 compression in the number 2 stage. Stop looking at the screen and fix the damn tank, or I will have your stripes on my desk by sunset." The sergeant flinched, sweat dripping from the tip of his nose onto the screen, stammering an excuse about sensor ghosts. But Sterling wasn't listening, his eyes already darting around the bay, looking for someone to blame, someone to vent the crushing pressure building behind his eyes, and that was when his gaze landed on the old man standing quietly by the tool bench near the rear tracks. He was an anomaly in this world of uniform camouflage and high-tech weaponry, a civilian contractor, or perhaps just a volunteer relic from the base's historical society who had been cleared to assist with legacy hardware context, though Sterling had never bothered to ask his name. The man, whose name was Elias but whom the soldiers simply called Pops or ignored entirely, looked like he had been carved out of the desert sandstone itself, an elderly American male with a thick, unruly white beard that hid the scars on his jawline, wearing a faded red flannel shirt that had seen better decades, loose-fitting blue jeans stained with grease, and a pair of worn leather work boots that were cracked and dusty. Elias was holding a heavy torque wrench, his eyes fixed on the exposed turbine with a look of intense, almost sorrowful concentration. But what drew Sterling's ire wasn't the man's attire or his presence, but his hands. They were trembling. It was a constant, rhythmic shaking, a tremor that rattled the heavy steel tool in his grip, making a soft clink-clink-clink sound against the metal workbench, a sound that, in the silence following Sterling's outburst, seemed deafeningly loud. To Captain Sterling, that tremor represented everything he despised: weakness, age, inefficiency, and a lack of control. He marched over to the old man, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel-strewn concrete, his shadow falling over Elias like a threat. "Hey, you!" Sterling barked, snapping his fingers in front of the old man's face. "The noise, stop it!" Elias looked up slowly, his eyes a piercing, watery blue surrounded by a roadmap of deep wrinkles, and he didn't flinch, didn't snap to attention, didn't look afraid, which only infuriated Sterling more. "I'm just prepping the torque settings, Captain," Elias said, his voice gravelly and soft, barely audible over the ambient noise of the base. "That turbine ain't reading right on the computer because it's not a sensor issue. It's a acoustic seal resonance. I can hear it. The harmonic is off." He lifted the wrench again, his hand shaking violently as he tried to adjust the dial, the metal tool wobbling in the air like a erratic pendulum. Sterling watched the tremor with open disgust, a sneer curling his upper lip. "You can hear it," Sterling mocked, turning to glance at his crew, inviting them to share in the ridicule. "Did you hear that, gentlemen? We have millions of dollars in diagnostic equipment, satellite uplinks, and factory-trained mechanics, but this civilian wants us to believe he can hear a pressure leak over the sound of his own hands shaking apart." A few of the younger privates chuckled nervously, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to align themselves with the predator in the room, while the older NCOs looked down at their boots, uncomfortable with the display but unwilling to intervene. Sterling stepped closer, invading Elias' personal space, the brim of his patrol cap nearly touching the old man's forehead. "Look at you," Sterling hissed, pointing at the trembling hand holding the wrench. "You're a liability. You can barely hold a coffee cup, let alone calibrate a precision instrument on a $60 million war machine. Who even authorized you to be in this bay? This is a combat zone preparation area, not a nursing home day trip. Keep listening. And which city are you listening from? And if you enjoy the story, please subscribe for more." Elias didn't defend himself, didn't explain that the nerve damage in his hands came from a shockwave that had liquefied the insides of a T-72 tank 40 years ago while he was pulling a burning crewman out of a hatch. Nor did he mention that the tremor got worse when he was near the smell of burning JP-8 fuel, because his body remembered the trauma even if his mind stayed steel-trap sharp. He just lowered the wrench, placing it gently on the bench to stop the rattling, and wiped his greasy palms on his jeans. "The seal on the recuperator," Elias said, pointing with a shaking finger toward the dark recess of the engine bay. "It's micro-fractured. The computer won't see it until the heat expands the metal. If you run it hard, it'll blow the back deck off. I can fix it, but I need 20 minutes and a shim from the legacy kit." Sterling laughed, a harsh, barking sound that lacked any humor. "You think I'm going to let you touch my tank?" Sterling asked incredulously. "With those hands, you'd probably drop a bolt into the intake and destroy the whole turbine. Number absolutely not." He turned to the master sergeant. "Get him out of here. Escort him to the gate. I don't want him within 1,000 yards of this vehicle." The master sergeant, a burly man named Rodriguez who had seen Elias working quietly in the background for weeks and knew the old man cleaned the latrines when no one asked, looked hesitant. "Captain, with all due respect, the old-timer knows these engines. He fixed the loader's arm on Bravo 2 last week when the tech reps were stumped." Sterling spun around, his face purple. "Are you questioning my order, Sergeant? I don't care if he fixed a toaster oven. Look at him. He's shaking like a leaf. This is a high-performance environment. We require precision. We require strength. He is a safety hazard and a distraction. Remove him. Now!" The order hung in the superheated air, heavy and absolute. Elias looked at Rodriguez, a small, sad smile touching his lips beneath the white beard, and gave a nearly imperceptible nod, silently releasing the sergeant from the burden of insubordination. "It's all right, son," Elias whispered to Rodriguez. "I'll go. Just check the recuperator seal, please." Sterling overheard and stepped between them, physically shoving the old man back a step. "You will give no orders here. You are a civilian. You are nothing. You are a guest who has overstayed his welcome." The physical contact was a breach of protocol, a shocking escalation that made the entire maintenance bay go dead silent, the only sound the distant thump-thump-thump of a Chinook helicopter beating the air. Elias stumbled slightly in his worn boots, catching his balance against the workbench, his hands trembling more violently now, not from fear but from the adrenaline spike of confrontation, the old combat instincts waking up in the lizard brain, flooding his system with chemicals he hadn't needed in decades. He looked at his shaking hands, then up at the captain, his eyes darkening, shifting from watery blue to a cold, hard slate. For a second, the atmosphere in the bay shifted, a sudden drop in pressure as if a storm had just entered the room, and the young soldiers felt the hair on the back of their necks stand up without knowing why. Elias took a breath, the smell of the tank filling his lungs, grounding him. "Captain," Elias said, his voice steady even if his hands were not. "Disrespect me all you want, but respect the machine. She talks if you listen. If you take her out with that fracture, you'll kill your crew." Sterling sneered, dismissing the warning with a wave of his hand. "Get out," he spat, "before I have the MPs drag you out." The stakes were set. The tank was broken. The clock was ticking down to the most important moment of Sterling's career, and the only man who knew how to save them was being kicked out into the dust, dismissed as a broken, trembling relic of a war that the new generation thought they had outgrown. The tension was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the bay as Elias picked up his small canvas tool bag, his hands shaking so much he struggled to close the zipper. A final humiliation under the watchful, mocking eyes of the captain, while the massive engine of the Widowmaker sat cold and dead, waiting for a disaster that was now inevitable. The heat outside the maintenance bay was a physical assault, a suffocating wall of thermal oppression that instantly coated Elias' skin in a sheen of sweat as he was escorted past the concertina wire perimeter of the active staging area, his boots kicking up small clouds of alkali dust that swirled around his ankles like restless ghosts. But even as Sergeant Rodriguez walked him toward the civilian transport waiting area, the deep, resonant thrum of the base's activity seemed to vibrate through the soles of his feet, a familiar rhythm that both comforted and tormented him, reminding him of a life he had supposedly left behind decades ago, but which still lived in the phantom sensations of his trembling hands. Rodriguez didn't speak for a long time, his jaw tight with a mixture of embarrassment and suppressed anger, kicking a loose rock across the asphalt with unnecessary force before finally stopping near a stack of empty ammo crates, where the shadow of the guard tower offered a sliver of respite from the merciless sun. "I'm sorry, Pops," Rodriguez muttered, refusing to meet the old man's eyes, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his sidearm not out of threat, but out of a nervous habit born from the tension radiating from the maintenance bay behind them. "The captain, he's under a lot of pressure. The generals are already landing at the airstrip. If Widowmaker isn't on the line in 30 minutes, heads are going to roll, and Sterling is just trying to keep his attached to his neck." Elias sat slowly on one of the wooden crates, his joints popping audibly, and placed his shaking hands on his knees, staring back toward the dark mauve Bay 4 where the silhouette of the tank loomed like a dormant predator. "Pressure doesn't excuse blindness, Sergeant," Elias replied softly, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "He's looking at the screens, but he's not seeing the machine. That turbine is crying. If he forces the compression cycle with that fractured seal, the heat spike will warp the main shaft. It won't just fail, it'll scream." Inside the bay, the situation was deteriorating with terrifying speed as Captain Sterling stood atop the turret of the Abrams, screaming into his headset while the diagnostic laptop balanced precariously on the blowout panels, its screen flashing a series of amber warnings that he was furiously overriding with administrative command codes. "Bypass the sensor!" Sterling roared at the driver, a 19-year-old kid named Miller who was sweating so profusely his hands were slipping off the yoke. "The computer is giving us a false positive on the vibration sensor. I want a hard restart on the engine control unit. Do it now." Miller hesitated, his eyes flicking to the red warning light on his dashboard that indicated a catastrophic resonance imbalance, the very thing the old man had warned them about. But the terrifying presence of the captain looming above him, threatening to destroy his career before it had even begun, was a more immediate danger than a mechanical failure. "Sir, the manual says a hard restart with a vibration warning could," Miller began, but Sterling cut him off with a kick to the back of the driver's hatch, the sound of the boot hitting the armor ringing out like a gunshot in the enclosed space. "I don't care what the manual says, Private. I'm giving you a direct order. Override the safety and crank it. The congressional delegation is 10 minutes out. Do you want to be the reason the 1st Armored Division looks like a bunch of amateurs?" The intimidation worked, as it always did, and Miller's trembling fingers flipped the toggle switch, bypassing the safety protocols that were written in the blood of previous tank crews, and he pressed the ignition button. A high-pitched whine began to build, the distinctive sound of a gas turbine engine spinning up, but underneath the smooth whistle of the intake there was a ragged, grinding dissonance, a sound like gravel being crushed between two heavy steel plates, audible only to those who knew what to listen for. Outside, 200 yards away, Elias' head snapped up, his ears tuning into the frequency instantly and his hands clenched into fists, the tremor worsening as his body reacted to the mechanical distress call. "He's doing it," Elias whispered, standing up despite the heat making him dizzy. "He's forcing it." Rodriguez heard it too, a subtle wrongness in the engine's pitch, and he looked at the old man with wide eyes. "That doesn't sound right," the sergeant said. "It sounds tight." Elias didn't wait for permission. He started walking back toward the bay, his gait slow and limping but driven by a singular magnetic purpose. and Rodriguez, instead of stopping him, fell in step beside him, driven by a gut instinct that the captain was about to make a mistake that couldn't be undone. Back inside the bay, the engine roared to life, spewing a cloud of dark, unburned fuel smoke that billowed up to the rafters, choking the mechanics who were standing clear of the exhaust plume. Sterling pumped his fist in the air, a look of triumphant arrogance plastered across his sweaty face as he looked down at the crew. "You see," he shouted over the roar, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the concrete walls. "It's running. It was a sensor ghost. Just like I said, you people are so afraid of the computer you forget who is in command. I am in command, not the machine, me." He climbed down from the turret, jumping to the ground with a flourish, expecting admiration, but the faces of his men were pale, their eyes fixed on the rear deck of the tank where the heat haze was shimmering with an intensity that shouldn't have been possible after only 30 seconds of idling. The grinding noise was getting louder, a rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum that was beginning to shake the tools on the nearby benches, vibrating the floor plates beneath their feet. Sterling ignored it, checking his reflection in the side mirror of the tank, wiping a smudge of grease from his cheek, when he saw Elias and Rodriguez re-entering the bay. The captain's triumph instantly curdled into a vicious, cold rage. He marched toward them, intercepting them before they could get within 50 feet of the tank, his hand resting on the holster of his 9, a gesture of aggression that was dangerously out of place in a maintenance environment. "I told you to get him off my base," Sterling hissed at Rodriguez, ignoring the sergeant's rank and years of service. "And yet here he is, like a bad penny or a fungus." He turned his sneer onto Elias, who was staring past him at the trembling exhaust grills of the tank. "What are you doing here, old man? Did you come to beg for a job, or did you just want to see what competence looks like?" Sterling gestured grandly at the roaring tank. "Listen to that. That is the sound of readiness. That is the sound of lethal force, something you clearly know nothing about." Elias didn't look at Sterling. His eyes were locked on the number 2 exhaust port, where the metal was beginning to turn a dull, angry cherry red. "Turn it off," Elias said, his voice flat and hard, cutting through the noise. "Captain, the harmonic is hitting the critical frequency. The recuperator is going to shatter. You have maybe 60 seconds before the turbine blades strip." Sterling laughed, a manic, high-pitched sound that bordered on hysteria. "You are delusional," Sterling shouted, grabbing Elias by the shoulder of his faded red shirt and dragging him forcibly closer to the tank, near the safety line but uncomfortably close to the heat wash. "Look at it. It's holding idle perfectly. You're just jealous because you're a washed-up has-been who shakes so much he can't even hold a wrench. Look at your hands." Sterling grabbed Elias' left hand and held it up for the entire bay to see, the limb vibrating uncontrollably in the captain's crushing grip. "Look at this weakness. This is what you are. A trembling, broken coward who hides in the motor pool because he can't hack it in the real world anymore. You want to give me advice. You can't even button your own shirt without help." The cruelty of the moment was absolute. The young soldiers looked away, ashamed to witness the abuse of an elder, but too terrified of Sterling's wrath to intervene. Elias didn't pull his hand away. He let Sterling hold it, let him mock the nerve damage that was the receipt for a life spent in the fires of hell that this captain had only read about in textbooks. Elias looked into Sterling's eyes, and for a moment the captain faltered, because the look he received in return was not one of shame, but of profound, terrifying pity. "My hands shake," Elias said quietly, "so that others could hold theirs steady. You don't know why they shake, Captain, and I pray to God you never have to learn." The dignity of the statement hung in the air, silencing the laughter of the few sycophants who had been chuckling, but Sterling was too far gone, his ego too wrapped up in the need to dominate. He shoved Elias backward, causing the old man to stumble into a stack of oil drums, the hollow clang echoing through the bay. "Get him out of my sight!" Sterling screamed, turning his back on the veteran. "And get that tank moving. We roll in 5 minutes." But as he turned, a new sound emerged from the engine of the Widowmaker, a high-pitched scream of metal on metal that sounded like a dying animal, followed by a sickening crunch. The ground lurched. A sudden, violent pressure wave slammed into everyone in the bay as the rear deck of the tank buckled upward, the heavy steel access doors blowing open with the force of a grenade blast. Black smoke, thick and oily, erupted from the engine compartment, instantly filling the bay with zero visibility, and the scream of the overtorqued turbine winding down sounded like a jet crashing. The soldiers hit the deck, covering their heads, debris raining down on the concrete, bolts, washers, and shards of ceramic heat shielding. Sterling, who had been closest to the rear, was knocked flat on his face, his pristine uniform instantly ruined by a spray of hot hydraulic fluid. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hissing of ruptured lines and the coughing of the crew. Then the alarm klaxons began to blare. The tank was dead. The 68-ton pride of the battalion was now a smoking, immobile brick, exactly as the old man had predicted. Slowly, the smoke began to clear, pulled out by the ventilation fans that kicked into overdrive, revealing the carnage. The entire rear power pack was destroyed, the turbine housing cracked open like an egg. Sterling scrambled to his feet, slipping in the oil, his face a mask of soot and shock, his eyes wide with the realization that his career had just detonated along with the engine. He looked around wildly for a scapegoat, his mind refusing to accept his own culpability, and his eyes landed on Elias, who was standing by the oil drums, unharmed, brushing dust off his sleeve with his trembling hand. Elias hadn't flinched. He hadn't ducked. He had stood his ground, watching the physics play out with the grim inevitability of a man who knows the cost of arrogance. Sterling's shock morphed instantly into a blinding, irrational hatred. He couldn't blame the computer. He couldn't blame the crew without admitting he ordered the override. He needed a villain. He pointed a shaking finger at Elias. "Sabotage!" Sterling screamed, his voice cracking, sounding unhinged. You did this! You touched the tank earlier! I saw you! You loosened a bolt! You compromised the intake!" The accusation was insane, a desperate lie born of panic, but Sterling committed to it with the fervor of a drowning man. "Sergeant Rodriguez, arrest him!" Sterling bellowed, drawing his own weapon, the 9-pistol shaking in his hand far more than Elias ever had. "Arrest this man for sabotage of government property and treason! He destroyed my tank!" The escalation had reached a breaking point. A captain was pointing a loaded weapon at an unarmed, elderly civilian in the middle of a maintenance bay, accusing him of a crime everyone knew was impossible. Rodriguez stepped forward, his hands raised, putting himself between the gun and the old man. "Captain, put the weapon down," Rodriguez said, his voice firm but edged with fear. "He didn't touch the engine. You ordered the override. We all heard it." Sterling's eyes were wild, darting between his men, seeing the judgment in their eyes. "You're taking his side," Sterling spat. "You're mutinying against your commanding officer." The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer, military police, fire trucks, and the distinctive heavy engines of the general's convoy arriving to inspect the unit. The timing could not have been worse. Sterling was cornered, humiliated, and armed. "I am the ranking officer here," Sterling shouted, stepping around Rodriguez to aim directly at Elias' chest. "And I say he is a threat. Get on your knees, old man, now, or I will put you down." Elias looked at the gun barrel, then up at Sterling's eyes. He didn't kneel, he didn't beg. He simply sighed, a sound of infinite weariness, and took a slow step forward, the tremor in his hands still present, but his body language shifting into something else entirely. A posture of command that was so subtle, so ingrained, that only those who had served in the deep combat arms would recognize it. "Son," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the gravelly softness and gaining a steel edge that cut through the hysteria. "You don't want to do this. You have made a mistake. Don't turn it into a fatality." Sterling cocked the hammer of the pistol. "I said on your knees." The bay froze. The soldiers held their breath. The tension was a physical wire pulled to the snapping point. And then, from the open bay doors, a voice boomed out, not a shout, but a projection of authority that stopped time itself. "Captain Sterling!" The voice belonged to a full-bird colonel, the battalion commander, who had just walked in, flanked by 2 military police officers and a tall, severe-looking man with 3 stars on his collar, Lieutenant General Vance, the corps commander. They stopped dead, taking in the scene. The smoking, destroyed tank, the oil-slicked floor, and their company commander pointing a weapon at an old man in dirty clothes. Sterling froze, the gun still raised, his brain unable to process the sudden shift in reality. "General, Colonel," Sterling stammered, not lowering the weapon. I have apprehended a saboteur, this civilian. He destroyed the Widowmaker." General Vance narrowed his eyes, stepping past the colonel, ignoring the danger of the waved gun, and focused his gaze not on Sterling, but on the old man standing in the oil. The general's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition passing through his stoic mask, but he said nothing, waiting, watching. Sterling, sensing the hesitation but misinterpreting it, doubled down. "He's a security risk, sir. He's mentally unstable. Look at him shake. He compromised the mission," Sterling shouted, desperate to control the narrative. "He shouldn't even be on this base." The general remained silent, his gaze fixed on Elias, analyzing the stance, the beard, the eyes. The silence stretched, agonizing and long, as the smoke from the ruined turbine swirled around them like the fog of war, and Elias stood amidst the wreckage of Sterling's career, waiting for the inevitable collision of past and present. The silence that followed the arrival of Lieutenant General Vance was heavier than the 68 tons of dead steel sitting in the center of the bay. a crushing, suffocating weight that pressed the air out of the room and turned the suffocating heat of the Mojave morning into a cold, clinical vacuum of impending judgment. And even Captain Sterling, whose arrogance had been a shield against reality for his entire career, felt the temperature in his blood drop to near freezing as he stood there with his 9 pistol still leveled at the chest of the old mechanic, the weapon trembling in his grip not from nerve damage, but from the sudden, terrifying realization that he had just pointed a lethal weapon at an unarmed civilian in front of the Corps commander. General Vance did not shout, did not scream, did not even reach for his own sidearm. He simply stood there, a monolith of weathered skin and crisp OCP camouflage, his 3 silver stars glinting in the harsh shafts of sunlight piercing the smoke-filled bay, his eyes concealed behind dark aviator sunglasses that reflected the chaotic scene with a terrifying lack of emotion. "Captain," Vance said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the chest cavities of every soldier present, a tone of command so absolute that it bypassed the conscious brain and struck directly at the primal instinct to obey. "Holster that weapon before I have the MPs shatter your arm." The order was not a suggestion, and Sterling, blinking rapidly as if waking from a fevered dream, looked down at the gun in his hand with a mixture of confusion and horror before clumsily shoving it back into his drop-leg holster, fumbling with the retention strap like a cadet on his first day of basic training. "General, the situation was," he was. "Aggressive," Sterling stammered, his voice thin and reedy, stripping away the veneer of authority he had worn so tightly just moments before. But Vance was no longer looking at him. The general had already stepped forward, his boots moving through the slick of hydraulic fluid and oil with a deliberate, predatory grace, ignoring the captain entirely to focus his attention on the smoking ruin of the Widowmaker's engine deck. The bay was deathly quiet now, the only sounds the ticking of cooling metal, the distant hum of the ventilation fans, and the ragged breathing of the soldiers who were terrified to move a muscle, their eyes darting between the furious, sweating captain and the stoic general who was now running a gloved hand along the fractured casing of the turbine. Elias had not moved. He stood exactly where he had been, his hands still trembling by his sides, his face obscured by the soot and grime of the explosion, his blue eyes fixed on the general with a look that was hard to decipher. Was it fear? Resignation? Or something else, something closer to the weary recognition of a man who has seen too many generals and too many broken tanks to be impressed by rank alone? Vance leaned in close to the wreckage, smelling the acrid scent of the burned recuperator, and then turned his head slowly, scanning the faces of the terrified crew before landing back on Sterling. "You overrode the safety," Vance stated, not as a question but as a fact, his voice devoid of inflection. Sterling flinched, his face flushing a deep, blotchy red. "Sir, the sensors were faulty. The computer was giving false positives. We have a live-fire demonstration in less than an hour, and I had to make a command decision to ensure readiness. I was prioritizing the mission." Vance stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching until it became physically painful, and then he removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were the color of cold steel, surrounded by the crow's feet of a man who had spent 30 years squinting into the sun of foreign deserts. "You prioritized your ego, Captain," Vance said softly, "and you destroyed a $6 million asset, but that is a matter for the inquiry. Right now I am interested in something else." The general turned his body, shifting his entire focus toward Elias, who was wiping his greasy hands on a rag with that rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor. "You," Vance said, stepping closer to the old man, invading his personal space not with aggression, but with an intense, probing curiosity. "The MP at the gate said there was an incident, said you were being removed. Yet here you are, standing in the blast zone of a catastrophic failure, seemingly the only man in this bay who isn't surprised that this tank blew itself apart." Sterling, desperate to regain control of the narrative, stepped forward again. "General, he's the one. He's a senile old vagrant the maintenance chief felt sorry for. He was distracting my men, shaking all over the place, dropping tools. I tried to have him removed for safety, and I believe he loosened the intake manifold out of spite. That's why it blew. He sabotaged it." Vance held up a single hand, palm out, silencing Sterling instantly without even looking at him. "Quiet," Vance whispered, the word cutting like a whip. He kept his eyes locked on Elias. "I asked him." Elias took a breath, the rag still moving in his shaking hands, and looked the general in the eye. "It wasn't the intake, General," Elias said, his voice raspy from the smoke but steady in its cadence. It was the recuperator seal, microfracture. Acoustic resonance was off by about 40 hertz. I told him. He didn't listen. Vance's eyebrows twitched slightly, a microscopic reaction that went unnoticed by everyone except perhaps Elias. Acoustic resonance? Vance repeated, tilting his head slightly. You heard a microfracture in a gas turbine engine over the ambient noise of a motor pool. Sterling let out a scoffing laugh, unable to help himself. See, sir, he's crazy. He claims he can hear the metal talking. He's delusional. But Vance didn't laugh. Instead, he stepped even closer to Elias until he was standing just 2 feet away, studying the old man's face, the scars hidden beneath the beard, the way he held his shoulders, and most of all, the way his hands shook. I knew a man once, Vance said slowly, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were accessing a file in his memory that hadn't been opened in a very long time. A long time ago, during the push into the Euphrates River Valley, we had a tank commander in the 2nd Armored Cavalry. He claimed he could tell the difference between a T-72 and a T-55 just by the sound of their tracks hitting the sand from 2 miles away. The air in the bay seemed to freeze. Elias lowered his eyes, focusing on his boots, his tremor increasing slightly in intensity. Lots of men hear things in the desert, General, Elias murmured. Heat plays tricks on the ears. Vance didn't blink. This man wasn't hearing tricks. He was the most lethal gunner the Army ever produced. They said he didn't aim with the computer, he aimed with his nervous system. But the war, it took something from him. The vibration, the constant concussion of the main gun. It damaged his nerves. Vance's eyes dropped to Elias' hands, watching the frantic dance of the fingers. By the end of the campaign, his hands shook so bad he couldn't hold a spoon, but put his hands on the yoke of an Abrams, and they were stone still. Sterling, sensing the conversation drifting into a realm he didn't understand and didn't like, tried to interrupt again. General, with all due respect, this is story time for the VFW. We have a crisis here. I need a replacement tank immediately, or the battalion is going to fail the certification. This man is a liability. Can we please have the MPs remove him so we can do our jobs? Vance finally turned on Sterling, and the look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated loathing. Your job, Captain, Vance said, his voice dangerously low, was to maintain this vehicle. You failed. Your job was to lead these men. You failed. And now you are interrupting me while I am trying to determine if I am standing in the presence of a ghost. The word hung in the air. Ghost. Sterling looked confused. A ghost, sir. He's a janitor. Vance ignored him, turning back to Elias. The man I knew, Vance continued, pressing the issue, probing for a reaction, disappeared after the Gulf. He refused the Silver Star, refused the pension. He just walked away, said he didn't want the recognition, said the only recognition he deserved was the silence of the dead. Elias remained silent, his jaw working beneath the white beard, his eyes shifting away from the general's piercing gaze. I'm just a mechanic, General, Elias said again, but the denial lacked force. I fix what's broken, that's all. Vance walked around Elias, circling him like a shark, observing every detail. The worn-out boots that were laced in a specific non-standard pattern used by tankers in the 90s to allow for quicker removal in case of fire. The fading tattoo on his forearm that was mostly obscured by grease but looked suspiciously like the outline of a phantom. The way he stood with his weight slightly forward, balanced on the balls of his feet. The stance of a man ready to move inside a confined turret. Just a mechanic, Vance repeated, stopping in front of him. Then tell me, mechanic, why is your tool bag arranged that way? He pointed to the open canvas bag on the bench. Spanners on the left, heavy torque on the right, distinct separation of metric and standard. That's not a mechanic's layout. That's a loader's layout, muscle memory. You arrange them so you can grab them in the dark when the emergency lights go out. Elias flinched. It was a small detail, a tiny slip in his disguise, but Vance had caught it. Habit, Elias said curtly. Efficient. Vance nodded slowly. Efficiency, yes, that was his word too. Efficiency is the mother of survival. The general's suspicion was hardening into certainty, but he needed proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof that would strip away the years and the beard and the grime. He looked at the shattered tank, then back at the captain. Captain Sterling, Vance barked. Me the diagnostic log from the onboard computer. The hard drive should still be intact. Sterling scrambled onto the hull, desperate to be useful, and pried the ruggedized hard drive from its casing, handing it down to the general. Vance took a portable reader from his aide, plugged it in, and scrolled through the data. Here, Vance said, pointing to the screen. Timestamp 0942, vibration warning, override code entered. Timestamp 0943, catastrophic failure. He looked at Sterling. You killed this tank, Captain, but look at this. He pointed to a line of data recorded just seconds before the explosion. The turret rotation, it moved 3 degrees right, elevation up 2 degrees. Sterling looked at the screen, confused. I didn't authorize turret movement. The hydraulics were cold. Vance looked at Elias. The turret moved because someone was inside the override loop. Someone was trying to vent the pressure by opening the breach, but the system was locked out. Vance looked at Elias with a new intensity. You were trying to save the crew, weren't you? Even from the outside, you tried to manually trip the breach block sensor to cut the fuel flow. Elias said nothing, but his hands stopped shaking for a split second, clenched into tight fists. That's a trick only the 7th Corps knew, Vance whispered. The Ghost Protocol. Bypass the fuel limiter by tricking the computer into thinking the breach is open. The general's voice rose, filling the bay. There are only 3 men alive who know how to do that. One is in a wheelchair in Walter Reed. One is the Secretary of Defense. And the third is a man who was listed as missing in action in spirit, if not in body, 25 years ago. Sterling looked between them, his face pale. General, what are you talking about? Who is he? Vance stepped back, looking Elias up and down, putting the pieces together. The tremor, the knowledge, the specific lacing of the boots, the Ghost Protocol override attempt. I'm talking about the man who taught the entire armored division how to kill tanks in the dark, Vance said, his voice thick with reverence and disbelief. I'm talking about the Desert Ghost. He looked at Elias. That's what they called you, isn't it, before the world forgot? Elias looked up, and for the first time the humble facade cracked. The blue eyes burned with a fire that had been banked but never extinguished. They called me a lot of things, General, Elias said, his voice suddenly strong, filling the silence of the bay. But mostly they called me when everything else had failed. The shift was complete. The dynamic in the room had inverted. Sterling was no longer the predator. He was an irrelevant annoyance. The general was no longer the highest authority. He was a student standing before a master. But the reveal wasn't fully landed yet. Sterling was too stupid, too blinded by his own ego to accept it. This is ridiculous, Sterling shouted, breaking the spell. Desert Ghost, it's a fairy tale, a campfire story for privates. This man is a bum. He's a shaking, broken old man. Prove it. You think he's a legend? Put him in the simulator. Put him in the gunner's seat. He can't even hold a cup of coffee without spilling it. You think he can hit a target? The challenge hung in the air, gross and disrespectful, but Vance looked at Elias with a grim smile. That's an excellent idea, Captain, Vance said. The simulator is fully operational in Bay 1. If he's just a confused old mechanic, he'll fail. But if he is who I think he is... Vance let the sentence trail off. What do you say, Pops? One last ride. Show this captain what a trembling hand can do. Elias looked at his hands, the constant shimmer of nerves, then at the sneering face of Captain Sterling, and finally at the respectful, challenging gaze of the general. He took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of the destroyed tank one last time. I don't need a simulator, Elias said softly, but if it shuts him up, lead the way. The Close Combat Tactical Trainer, CCTT, facility was a stark contrast to the gritty, sun-scorched reality of the maintenance bays, a windowless, climate-controlled cathedral of modern warfare where the air was chilled to a precise 65 degrees and smelled of ozone, server coolant, and the sterile anxiety of evaluation. And as the small procession of soldiers, led by the furious stride of Captain Sterling and the measured, predatory pace of General Vance, entered the darkened room, the hum of the massive server banks provided a low-frequency soundtrack to what felt like an execution. In the center of the room sat the simulators, exact, full-fidelity replicas of the M1A2 Abrams crew compartments, severed from their tracks and chassis, mounting on hydraulic motion platforms that could replicate every lurch, jolt, and concussion of actual combat with bone-rattling accuracy. Sterling marched to the control station, a raised dais lined with monitors that allowed the instructors to play God, manipulating weather, terrain, and enemy forces with the click of a mouse. And his face was set in a grimace of malicious anticipation, because he believed with every fiber of his arrogant being that he was about to expose a fraud and save his own career by proving that the general's nostalgia had clouded his judgment. Set it up, Sterling barked at the terrified simulation operator, a young sergeant who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. Scenario Bravo Zulu 6. The last stand profile, night conditions, sandstorm, 3 battalions of T-90s advancing in a wedge formation, disable his thermal optics, disable his laser rangefinder, make him shoot on auxiliary sites only. The operator's jaw dropped, and he looked at General Vance for a countermand, because Bravo Zulu 6 was a stress test scenario designed for a full platoon of tanks, not a single gunner, and disabling the thermals and laser in a night sandstorm was technically impossible. a death sentence meant to teach humility to cocky lieutenants, not a fair test for an old man with trembling hands. Vance, however, did not intervene. He simply crossed his arms over his chest, his face unreadable behind the aviator sunglasses he had put back on despite the indoor setting, and gave a single, curt nod. "Do it," Vance said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "If he is who I think he is, he doesn't need the laser." Elias stood by the open hatch of the simulator pod, looking small and frail against the high-tech machinery, his hands shaking so violently now that he had to clasp them together against his chest to keep them from hitting the metal frame. The soldiers who had followed them from the maintenance bay lined the walls, whispering nervously, their eyes fixed on the old man's boots, those worn, dusty boots that had walked through hell decades before these kids were born. Sterling approached Elias, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Last chance to walk away, old man," Sterling sneered, leaning in close so only Elias could hear. "You can't even hold a spoon steady. How are you going to hold a reticle on a moving target at 2,000 meters in a sandstorm? You're going to embarrass yourself. You're going to vomit in there. Just admit you're a janitor and I'll let you leave with a warning." Elias looked up, his blue eyes tired but strangely calm, and for a fleeting second the tremor in his hands seemed to transfer into his voice, making it vibrate with a low, resonant intensity. "The tank doesn't care if I shake, Captain," Elias whispered. "The tank only cares if I hesitate, and I never hesitate." With a slow, agonizing effort that made the watching soldiers wince in sympathy, Elias climbed up the small gantry and lowered himself into the gunner's hatch, his movements stiff and arthritic, his joints popping audibly in the quiet room. It took him a full minute to get settled, fumbling with the headset connector, his shaking fingers struggling to align the pins, a display of physical infirmity that made Sterling laugh out loud, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the acoustic tiling. "Look at him," Sterling announced to the room, gesturing at the live feed on the main overhead monitor which showed Elias struggling to buckle his safety harness. "He's helpless. This is a waste of government electricity." But then Elias was in the seat. The interior of the simulator was dark, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of the auxiliary sight and the control panel. Elias took a deep breath, the smell of the rubber and electronics filling his nose, triggering a cascade of neural pathways that had been dormant for 20 years. He reached out and grabbed the Cadillacs, the dual hand grips that controlled the turret and the main gun, and then the miracle happened. The moment his skin touched the cold, textured plastic of the controls, the tremor stopped. It didn't fade, it vanished instantly. His hands, which had been fluttering like wounded birds a second ago, locked onto the controls with the rigidity of granite clamps. It was as if the circuit between man and machine had been closed, the vibration of his nerves finding a ground in the weapon system. On the large external monitors, the turret of the virtual tank snapped to center with a speed and precision that made the operator jump. "System check complete," Elias' voice came over the intercom, and it was not the voice of the old mechanic. It was a voice of gravel and iron, stripping away all age, all hesitation, all softness. "Loader, load sabot, driver, move out, scanning sector." The simulation went live. On the screens, a digital nightmare erupted, a howling sandstorm that reduced visibility to near zero, dark shapes moving in the swirling dust, the roar of enemy engines filling the headset. Sterling crossed his arms, waiting for the inevitable failure. "He can't see anything," Sterling muttered. "He's blind." Inside the simulator, Elias didn't look at the blacked-out thermal screen. He leaned his forehead against the brow pad of the auxiliary sight, closing his left eye, and he listened. He listened to the audio feed, differentiating the deep, throaty growl of the approaching T-90 diesel engines from the wind. He felt the vibration of the virtual hull. "Target," Elias whispered. 11 o'clock, range 1800, moving left to right, fast." He didn't wait for a confirmation. He squeezed the triggers. Boom. The sound of the main gun firing was deafening in the simulator, and on the main screen a massive fireball erupted in the distance, tearing through the digital gloom. A direct hit, a turret toss. "Target destroyed," the computer voice droned. Sterling blinked, his mouth opening slightly. "Lucky shot," he stammered. He guessed, but it wasn't a guess. The barrel swung right, traversing with a fluidity that looked less like a machine and more like an extension of a biological limb. "Target, 2 o'clock, range 2200, hull down." Boom, another fireball, another kill. The speed was increasing now. The enemy tanks were rushing him, a swarm of red icons on the instructor's map, but Elias was engaging them with a rhythm that defied logic. He wasn't using the laser rangefinder. He was using stadia reticle estimation, a lost art from the Cold War, calculating the distance by the size of the enemy tank in his scope, doing trigonometry in his head in split seconds while under fire. Boom, clang, whoosh, boom. The rhythm became a drumbeat of destruction. "Load heat," Elias barked. "Chopper, 12 o'clock high." He slewed the turret up, a move that was notoriously difficult to track a fast-moving air target without computer assistance. He fired. The helicopter on the screen disintegrated in a shower of pixels. General Vance stepped forward, pushing the stunned operator aside to look at the telemetry data. "Look at the traverse rates," Vance whispered, pointing at the scrolling numbers. "He's not overshooting. He's not correcting. He stops on the pixel every single time. Zero wasted movement." The general looked up at the screen, his face glowing with a mixture of vindication and awe. "It's the heartbeat rhythm," Vance said to the silent room. "He fires between the beats of his own heart to minimize body vibration. Only one man ever mastered that." Inside the pod, Elias was sweating, the years falling away, his mind locked in the box, that zone of hyperfocus where time slows down. He was no longer a gardener. He was no longer a trembling old man. He was the ghost. He was the predator of the desert. The simulation ramped up. Sterling, in a panic, grabbed the mouse and started spawning more enemies, infantry with RPGs, flank attacks, artillery strikes. He wanted to break the old man. He needed to break him. "Die, damn you!" Sterling hissed, adding 3 platoons on the left flank, but Elias just spun the turret, the movement so violent the hydraulic pumps screamed. He engaged 3 targets in 4 seconds, left, fire, right, fire, center, fire. It was a blur of violence. He was shooting faster than the autoloader could theoretically cycle, pushing the simulator's physics engine to its absolute limit. The soldiers in the room were gasping now, cheering involuntarily as the kill count on the screen ticked up. 10, 15, 20, 30 enemy tanks burning in the digital sand. It was impossible. It was a masterclass in violence. And then the final test. Sterling spawned a target directly behind the tank at point-blank range. "Behind you!" A private screamed from the wall, forgetting protocol. Elias didn't turn the turret. He shouted, "Driver, hard right, pivot steer." He spun the entire tank hull, using the vehicle's momentum to swing the gun barrel faster than the turret motor could drive it, a maneuver that was strictly forbidden in safety manuals because it could shear the traverse lock, but in combat it saved lives. As the tank spun, Elias fired while moving, a snapshot that defied physics. The round hit the enemy tank in the turret ring just as it was about to fire. The screen flashed white. "Scenario complete," the computer announced. "ENEMIS destroyed 42, friendly damage 0%, ammunition expended 42 rounds, accuracy 100%. The simulator went silent. The hydraulic pumps hissed and settled. The room was dead quiet. No one moved, no one breathed. Sterling stood frozen at the control console, his face the color of ash, his hands trembling now, the mouse slipping from his sweaty grip. He stared at the score, 100%, in a night sandstorm, without optics. It wasn't just a passing grade, it was a statistical impossibility. The hatch of the simulator hissed open. A hand reached up, a shaking, trembling hand, and grabbed the rim. Elias pulled himself up, his body instantly reverting to its frail state, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. He climbed down the gantry slowly, wiping sweat from his white beard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked smaller now, more fragile than ever, as if the spirit of the war machine had left him to return to the steel. He walked over to where Sterling and Vance stood. The silence was absolute. Elias stopped in front of Sterling, his hands shaking violently by his sides again, the tremor back with a vengeance. He looked up at the captain, whose arrogance had been vaporized. "The machine works fine, Captain," Elias said, his voice soft and raspy. "You just have to know how to ask it nicely." Sterling opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was broken, his authority, his ego, his world view, shattered by an old man in a flannel shirt. Then General Vance moved. He didn't speak. He stepped past Sterling, ignoring the captain as if he didn't exist, and walked directly up to Elias. The general, a 3-star commander of the entire corps, snapped his heels together, a sound like a pistol shot in the quiet room. He stood ramrod straight, chin up, and slowly, deliberately raised his hand in a salute. It wasn't a perfunctory salute. It was the slow, crisp salute reserved for the highest honors. "Sergeant Major Elias Thorne," Vance said, his voice thick with emotion, booming through the room. "Callsign Desert Ghost, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, 7th Corps, the man who held the terrifying line of sand alone for 3 hours in 1991, the man who refused the Medal of Honor because he said he didn't save enough of them." The general held the salute, his hand trembling slightly with emotion. "I thought you were dead, Sergeant Major. We all did." The room erupted in a collective gasp. The soldiers on the wall looked at each other in shock. The Desert Ghost. It was a myth they told in the barracks, the tank commander who never missed, who disappeared into the sand after the war, who was a ghost story used to scare new gunners, and he was standing right there, smelling of old sweat and machine oil. Slowly, hesitantly, the other soldiers in the room began to come to attention, first the sergeant at the console, then the privates along the wall, then the colonel. One by one, they snapped to attention and saluted, a wave of respect rippling through the room until every single person was saluting the trembling old man in the dirty jeans. Everyone except Sterling. Sterling stood alone, surrounded by a forest of salutes, isolated in his shame. He looked at Elias, then at the general, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had just tried to court-martial a living legend. He had pointed a gun at the most decorated tanker in the regiment's history. Elias looked at the general, his eyes misty. He didn't return the salute immediately. He looked at his shaking hand, willing it to be still. He took a breath, clenched his fist to steady it, and slowly, painfully raised his hand to his brow. The tremor was there, fighting him, but he held it. He held it for the men he lost. He held it for the machine. "General," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I'm not a sergeant major anymore. I'm just the gardener." Vance lowered his hand, his face softening. "Not today, Elias, not today." The general turned to the room, his voice shifting back to command steel. "At ease." The soldiers relaxed, but their eyes remained glued to Elias. Vance turned to Sterling, and the temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees. The general's face was a mask of cold fury. "Captain Sterling," Vance said, his voice quiet and dangerous, "you have just witnessed a demonstration of skill that you could not replicate in 1,000 lifetimes. You mocked this man, you threatened him, you pointed a weapon at him, and in doing so you dishonored the uniform you are wearing." Vance stepped closer to Sterling, ripping the Velcro unit patch off Sterling's shoulder in one violent motion. The sound of the tearing fabric was loud and shocking. "You are relieved of command, effective immediately," Vance spat. "You will report to my office at 800 hours to process your resignation. If you are late, I will have you court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer and endangering a civilian. Get out of my sight." Sterling stood there, stunned, holding the empty spot on his shoulder where his unit patch used to be. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with fear and confusion, realizing too late that rank is worn on the collar, but respect is earned in the blood. He turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing hollowly, a broken man walking into oblivion. The general turned back to Elias. "Elias," Vance said gently, "we have a problem. The Widowmaker is dead, but the battalion rolls in 20 minutes. We have a backup tank, but we don't have a gunner who can handle the lead position in this weather." Vance paused, a twinkle in his eye. "I know it's been a long time, and I know your hands shake, but do you think you have one more run in you? For old time's sake, the boys could use a lesson on how it's done." Elias looked at the simulator, then at the waiting soldiers, young men with fear and awe in their eyes. He looked at his trembling hands. He thought about the silence of his empty house, the years of hiding, the years of being nobody. He looked at the general. A slow smile spread across his face, hidden beneath the white beard. "Well, General," Elias said, the old fire burning in his blue eyes, "if you're buying the fuel, I suppose I can take her for a spin." The sun was beginning to dip toward the jagged spine of the mountains in the west, painting the Mojave sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange, a dramatic backdrop for the cloud of dust that hung suspended over the gunnery range like the aftermath of a biblical cataclysm. And as the column of tanks rumbled back toward the assembly area, the ground itself seemed to sigh in relief after the violence of the last hour, the vibrations of the heavy tracks settling into a rhythmic, lulling thrum that was the heartbeat of the armored division. In the lead tank, a borrowed M1A2 designated Iron Horse, Elias Thorne sat in the gunner's seat, his body slumped with an exhaustion that went deeper than bone and muscle, an exhaustion of the soul that came from waking up ghosts he had spent 20 years trying to bury. But despite the fatigue, there was a profound peace in the small, cramping space of the turret, a silence that existed only in the center of the noise, where the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid acted as a balm to his frayed nerves. He looked at his hands, resting on his lap now that the Cadillacs were released. They were shaking again, the violent, rhythmic tremor returning the moment the adrenaline faded, a reminder that he was mortal, that he was broken, and that the desert ghost was just a temporary state of being, a spirit he could borrow but never keep. Through the intercom, the voice of Private Miller, the young driver who had been terrorized by Captain Sterling only hours before, crackled with a reverence that bordered on religious awe. That was unbelievable, sir," Miller whispered, his voice trembling not with fear but with the adrenaline of having witnessed perfection. "That last target, the moving flank shot at 3,000 meters. I didn't even see it until it exploded. How did you know it was there?" Elias keyed the mic, his thumb fumbling slightly with the switch due to the tremor. "I didn't see it, son," Elias rasped, his voice sounding old again. "I felt the ground. Heavy armor vibrates the earth differently than a truck. You learn to listen with your feet." The column rolled into the motor pool, the massive machines lining up with a precision that had been lacking all morning, the crews moving with a newfound sharpness, inspired by the display they had just witnessed. And as the engines spooled down, whining into silence, the heavy silence of the desert evening took over. Elias struggled to climb out of the hatch. The adrenaline crash had left his joints stiff and painful, his arthritis flaring up with a vengeance, and it took him 2 tries to heave his body up through the ring, his boots scrambling for purchase on the anti-slip coating. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like an old man climbing out of a hole, his red flannel shirt dark with sweat, his white beard matted with dust. But this time no one laughed. As he lowered himself to the concrete, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud, he found the entire company formed up in a semicircle around the tank, not in a rigid formation, but in a respectful, silent gathering, hundreds of eyes fixed on him. General Vance stood at the front, flanked by the battalion staff, his face illuminated by the dying light, looking not at a subordinate, but at an equal. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, until Elias wiped his greasy hands on his jeans, the tremor making his fingers dance against the denim. "Show's over," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying in the stillness. "Check your track tension, clean your optics. The sand doesn't forgive a dirty lens just because you had a good day." It was a simple instruction, the kind a master mechanic gives to an apprentice, but the soldiers nodded as if it were scripture. General Vance stepped forward, holding out a canteen of water. Elias took it, his hand shaking so much that some of the water spilled down his beard as he drank, but he didn't care, and neither did they. "You haven't lost a step, Elias," Vance said softly, a sad smile playing on his lips. "If anything, you've gotten faster. The timing on that engagement sequence, I haven't seen that since the Battle of 73 Easting." Elias lowered the canteen, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I haven't gotten faster, General," Elias replied, his eyes looking past the soldiers to the darkening horizon. "I've just got less time to waste. When you get to my age, you don't hesitate because you don't know if you'll be around for the next heartbeat." The soldiers chuckled nervously, a release of tension, but the wisdom in the words landed heavy. One of the young lieutenants, a fresh-faced officer who had been visibly shaking during Sterling's tirade earlier, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Thorne." Sergeant Major," the lieutenant stammered. "The way you handled the system, without the computer, the way you knew the engine was failing earlier just by the sound. How do we learn that? The manual doesn't teach that." Elias looked at the young officer, then at the rows of faces behind him, faces of kids who had grown up with touchscreens and automated systems, who trusted the green light on the dashboard more than their own senses. He sighed, the sound of a man who has seen the wheel of history turn too many times. "The manual is written by engineers," Elias said, his voice gaining strength, projecting to the back of the group. "Engineers build the machine, but you have to live inside it. You have to die inside it." He held up his shaking hands, displaying them openly, no longer hiding the infirmity that Sterling had mocked. "You see these hands?" he asked. "You think this is weakness? You think this is just old age?" He paused, letting the question hang. "These hands shake because they remember the vibration of 1,000 rounds. They shake because they held the line when the computers failed, when the optics were smashed, when the radio was dead static and the only thing left was the man next to me. The machine is a tool, gentlemen. It is a hammer, but you are the hand that swings it. If you trust the computer more than you trust your own gut, you are already dead. The computer tells you what is happening. Your gut tells you what is about to happen." He walked slowly toward the young driver, Miller, who was standing by the fender of the tank. Elias reached out and placed a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder. "Captain Sterling wanted you to ignore the noise," Elias said gently. "He wanted you to force the machine to obey. That is why he failed. You don't force a tank. You don't conquer the desert. You negotiate with it. You listen to it. Respect the machine and it will bring you home. Disrespect it and it will be your coffin." Miller nodded, tears standing in his eyes, the validation from the legend washing away the shame of the morning. "Yes, Sergeant Major," Miller whispered. "I'll listen." Elias patted his shoulder and turned back to Vance. "I'm not a sergeant major, son," he reminded them again, a ghost of a smile visible in his beard. "I'm just the guy who fixes the lawnmowers." The humility wasn't an act. It was the armor he wore to keep the memories at bay. Vance looked at him, his expression serious. "Elias," the general said, "the position for master gunner at the divisional level is open. I can have the paperwork waived. I can reinstate your rank. We need you. These boys need you. Sterling is gone. You could teach them. You could make sure the next generation knows what you know." The offer hung in the air, a return to glory, a restoration of status, a chance to be the desert ghost again officially. The soldiers looked hopeful, wanting to be led by the legend. Elias looked around the base, at the flags snapping in the evening breeze, at the tanks, at the young faces. He looked at his hands, still trembling. He thought about the quiet of his garden, the smell of the soil, the peace of anonymity. He shook his head slowly. "No, General," Elias said softly. "My war is over. I fought it. I survived it. I don't want to teach them how to kill. I want them to learn how to survive so they can come home and be old men with shaking hands, just like me." The rejection was a shock, but it was also a lesson that glory is a young man's illusion and peace is an old man's prize. "But," Elias added, pointing a shaking finger at the destroyed hull of the Widowmaker still sitting in Bay 4, "I will fix that turbine before I go. I hate leaving a job unfinished." A ripple of laughter went through the group, warm and respectful. Vance nodded, understanding. "Fair enough, Elias, fair enough." The general snapped a salute again, and this time the entire battalion followed suit, hundreds of hands snapping to brows in a wave of unison that was more perfect than any drill. Elias didn't salute back this time. Instead, he simply placed his hand over his heart, bowed his head slightly, and then turned around. He picked up his canvas tool bag, the one with the loader's layout, and began to walk away, his figure silhouetted against the fiery sunset. He walked with a limp, his red shirt faded, his boots kicking up dust, a solitary figure moving away from the machines of war and back toward the world of the living. As he walked, the tremor in his hands seemed to settle into the rhythm of his steps, not a weakness, but a resonance, a vibration of a life lived fully, loudly, and without regret. The young soldiers watched him go until he was just a speck in the distance, a ghost fading back into the desert from which he came, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a new, heavy understanding of what it truly meant to serve. And in the maintenance bay, the Widowmaker sat silent, waiting for the touch of the only man who knew how to heal it, while the sun finally slipped below the horizon. Ending the day, the general saluted the gardener.